OK, bonjour tout le monde. Ici Joanne Whitmore, je suis chercheuse principale à la chaire de gestion du secteur de l'énergie. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à l'atelier sur l'économie circulaire qui est organisé par CIRANO, donc le Centre de recherche interuniversitaire, et le MELCC. Juste vous rappeler peut-être pour la conférence, les participants n'ont pas la parole, donc ce qu'ils doivent faire, c'est dans la boîte à droite, il y a la possibilité d'entrer des questions. Donc, à tout moment, si vous avez des questions ou des problèmes que vous avez adressés, vous pouvez vous pouvez soit utiliser le chatter ou bien les questions qu'on va pouvoir adresser directement à chacun des conférenciers. Donc, avant de commencer la conférence de cadrage, je souhaitais faire une petite présentation pour vous mettre en contexte. Donc, juste pour rappeler les gens que, en fait, le mandat de recherche, de projet de recherche qu'on a avec le MELCC et le CIRANO, ils nous ont mandaté, en fait, pour les aider à définir des orientations stratégiques pour le déploiement de l'économie circulaire au Québec dans le cadre de la stratégie gouvernementale en développement durable à l'horizon 2027. Comme vous savez, il y a déjà en fait une stratégie de développement durable, mais elle prend fin en 2020. Donc, le but, c'est de pouvoir intégrer pour la nouvelle mouture des orientations en économie circulaire. L'atelier va consister d'une conférence de cadrage qu'on a aujourd'hui, donc le 4 août. La conférence de cadrage, c'est pour préparer tous les participants qui sont confirmés à 3 différentes tables rondes virtuelles qui vont avoir lieu demain et après-demain. À partir de ça, on va avoir un rapport de synthèse de l'atelier qui va être préparé par l'équipe de recherche. Et ensuite, on va faire une présentation webinaire du rapport de synthèse à l'automne 2020 pour que les participants, puis aussi le plus grand public, peuvent prendre un peu le goût de ce qui est ressorti de cet exercice. Juste pour présenter mes collègues, on est une équipe de recherche pluridisciplinaire à travers le CIRANO. Donc, moi-même qui est avec la chaire de gestion du secteur de l'énergie et un collègue qui fait sa maîtrise avec Pierre-Olivier Pinault, mon collègue Hugo Gersh. À l'Institut EDEC, on a Benjamin Laplate, qui est le directeur des opérations. À l'Université de Laval, on a le professeur Bernard Corailly, qui, lui, va piloter davantage tout l'aspect de la rédaction du rapport avec son étudiant Wadji et Lali. Et à Polytechnique Montréal, on a Sophie Bernard, qui a travaillé sur plusieurs mandats en économie circulaire. Elle est professeure, elle, au département des mathématiques à Polytechnique. Pour nos partenaires du MELCC, c'est-à-dire plutôt nos points de contact, on a Léa Saint-Pierre, qui est conseillère en développement durable au MELCC, et puis Élodie Priant, avec lesquels on a travaillé pour organiser tout cet événement. Donc, l'objectif de l'atelier, c'est de valider auprès d'experts les intérêts puis les priorités en matière de déploiement de l'économie circulaire au Québec afin de les inclure dans la stratégie, comme j'ai mentionné. Le ministère a lui-même déjà fait une consultation à l'interne auprès de ses représentants de différents ministères et organismes gouvernementaux. Ils ont produit un rapport qui fait toute la synthèse de cette consultation-là à l'interne. On ne sait pas si ça va être public ou non, mais c'est quand même bien détaillé. Et nous, ce qu'on vient faire, en fait, c'est de les aider à travers des petits groupes de faire un peu une validation de ce qui est ressorti de ces discussions-là, mais aussi de voir s'il y a d'autres éléments auxquels on peut ajouter ou qu'on a peut-être oubliés. Fait que les 3 objectifs principaux, c'est d'identifier les secteurs économiques porteurs et les mesures prioritaires en économie circulaire au Québec, en tenant compte du contexte de la relance économique. C'est sûr que la relance économique, ça devient un enjeu incontournable. On avait beaucoup d'élan, si on veut, sur tous les enjeux environnementaux avant le contexte de la pandémie, mais maintenant, c'est important là, de vraiment faire un effort très, très conscient pour que l'environnement et l'économie avancent du même pas. On a aussi besoin d'identifier les leviers stratégiques et les freins à l'économie circulaire pour que ça puisse être déployé à une échelle beaucoup plus importante qu'actuellement. Puis ensuite, d'identifier des cibles et des indicateurs de performance pour faire le suivi de progrès vers l'amélioration de la circularité de l'économie à l'horizon 2027. Parce que évidemment, c'est l'économie circulaire, c'est assez complexe et il va falloir qu'on trouve des façons objectives pour pouvoir faire le suivi dans le temps. Donc, rapidement, je ne rentrerai pas dans l'économie circulaire 101 parce que les gens qu'on a invités, on assume qu'ils ont déjà un background ou du moins une connaissance de base sur l'économie circulaire. De toute façon, on a préparé un document de préambule pour ceux qui voulaient peut-être un petit refresher. Donc, je vous invite à aller le lire si vous ne l'avez pas fait encore. Ça donne un peu les définitions, le contexte, les objectifs de l'atelier, tout ça. Mais essentiellement, pourquoi l'économie circulaire? Bien, comme on sait, le gouvernement québécois s'est doté de cibles globales ambitieuses pour améliorer la performance environnementale de son économie. Puis pour atteindre, évidemment, ces cibles ambitieuses-là, il va falloir qu'il y ait des stratégies puis des mesures qui sont également aussi ambitieuses, dont l'économie circulaire. La définition que je présente ici, c'est celle qui est le plus souvent utilisée par l'Institut EDEC, Québec circulaire, le gouvernement et tout ça, mais c'est essentiellement, on le définit comme un système de production, d'échange et de consommation visant à optimiser l'utilisation des ressources à toutes les étapes de vie d'un bien ou d'un service, tout en réduisant l'empreinte environnementale et en contribuant au bien-être des individus et de la collectivité. Donc ça, c'est la définition plus globale et officielle. Pour moi, souvent, l'économie circulaire, c'est juste de faire mieux les choses en étant plus optimal, plus productif avec les ressources ou l'énergie, puis en assurant qu'on va minimiser le plus possible tous les intrants toxiques et puis aussi en s'assurant qu'on va avoir le moins de pertes possible, puis s'il y en a, on va pouvoir les revaloriser ou les recycler. Mais c'est essentiellement de faire les choses mieux que ce qu'on fait actuellement. C'est aussi une façon de réfléchir d'une façon plus systémique par rapport justement aux biens, aux services qu'on consomme ou qu'on produit. Il y a 4 objectifs globaux, si on veut, rattachés à l'économie circulaire. Puis tout ça, c'est détaillé dedans le préambule, donc je vous invite évidemment à le voir, puis à travers lesquels il y a 12 stratégies, dont des stratégies, ça peut être comme l'économie de fonctionnalité, par exemple, où on va passer d'être propriétaire de quelque chose, de plutôt de le louer ou de l'emprunter. Quand on pense, par exemple, à Car2Go, les bibliothèques, tout ça, c'est des économies de circularité. On a toutes les synergies industrielles où ce qui est des pertes ou des déchets dans un secteur peut être récupéré, réutilisé, soit à l'interne d'une usine ou bien vendu à un autre. Donc, il y a plusieurs stratégies dépendant des secteurs. Je ne vais pas passer à travers tout ça. C'est possible pour vous d'aller les voir dans le document. Mais grosso modo, les objectifs de ces stratégies-là, il y en a 4, c'est de repenser nos produits pour réduire la demande en ressources et préserver les écosystèmes. On veut aussi intensifier l'usage des produits, prolonger leur durée de vie ainsi que celle de leurs composantes, puis finalement, donner une nouvelle vie en fin de cycle par la revalorisation. Donc, juste pour revenir aux cibles que je parlais tout à l'heure, c'est juste un petit rappel. J'ai produit ce tableau-là. Je pensais que c'était important. Des fois, on oublie qu'on a beaucoup de cibles quand même quantitatives à atteindre. Puis des exemples. Puis ça aussi, c'est dans le document du préambule en annexe. Mais par exemple, on a le plan d'action sur les changements climatiques où on a une cible de réduction de 20% des gaz à effet de serre sous le niveau de 90 d'ici 2020, qui a été par la suite bonifié, si on veut, par aussi une commission parlementaire jusqu'en 2030 avec une réduction de moins 37,5%. On a une politique énergétique avec des cibles aussi ambitieuses qu'une réduction de 40% de la consommation des produits pétroliers sous le niveau de 90 d'ici 2030. C'est quand même extrêmement ambitieux au Québec, avec d'autres cibles comme éliminer l'usage du charbon thermique, puis d'augmenter de 25% la production totale d'énergie renouvelable, puis de 50% la production de bioénergie. Et toutes ces cibles-là, il faut que ça nous mène essentiellement à une réduction de 16 millions de tonnes de GES énergétique, qui est équivalent à 18% de celles émises en 90 d'ici 2030. Donc, c'est quand même très, c'est dans des politiques, c'est concret. On a Tech, par exemple, qui pilote toute la mise en œuvre de cette politique-là. On a aussi la politique de la mobilité durable qui vient rejoindre les autres cibles par rapport au GES, et ensuite, comme on sait, des politiques de gestion de matières résiduelles, puis de stratégie québécoise de l'eau jusqu'en 2030. Donc, on a besoin, évidemment, quelque chose, puis on espère que la stratégie gouvernementale du développement durable va pouvoir assurer une certaine cohérence entre toutes les initiatives puis mesures qui sont mises en place pour atteindre ces objectifs-là, puis aussi avoir la possibilité de faire une pierre deux coups, puis on espère que, évidemment, l'économie circulaire peut nous amener à ça. On pense aussi éventuellement à d'autres cibles qui pourront venir peut-être à travers une politique d'aménagement du territoire. Il faudrait des cibles pour la circularité de l'économie ou encore dans le secteur de l'agriculture. Donc, grosso modo, juste pour toucher sur les tables, il va y avoir 3 tables pour demain puis après-demain qui vont avoir lieu. Les différentes tables ont été assignées de façon à ce qu'il y ait une diversité dans les représentations des expertises pour les différentes tables. C'est pour ça que tout le monde est assigné. Et puis, ce qui va être important, c'est qu'il va y avoir 6 questions à répondre qu'on a déterminées entre le CIRANO et le MELCC pour vraiment aider le gouvernement à bien les orienter en matière d'économie circulaire. Je vous invite à lire à l'avance les 6 questions. Ça va être très intense. On va avoir 2 heures pour passer à travers ces 6 questions-là. Puis, les réponses qui vont sortir pour chacune des questions vont devoir être représentatives de la table. Donc, on cherche plus des réponses ou des recommandations qui vont faire un peu le consensus. Puis s'il n'y en a pas, c'est correct, on va le noter. Mais essentiellement, c'est à travers des délibérations, des remue-ménages, en 15 minutes à la fin, on va avoir des priorités ou des orientations très précises par rapport aux questions qu'on a mis de l'avant. Puis pour ça, ça va être interactif sur Zoom. Vous avez tous des liens uniques pour joindre vos tables. Donc, si vous n'avez pas ou vous êtes un peu confuse, puis je m'excuse de l'avance de la complexité de la logistique à cause qu'on a différentes plateformes, mais c'est vraiment la COVID qui fait que c'est pas évident. J'ai organisé des tables dans le passé, ça s'est super bien passé parce qu'on était évidemment tous un groupe, tout le monde ensemble. Mais je vous remercie de votre patience et de votre compréhension. On va espérer qu'il n'y aura pas trop de pépins techniques pour ces tables. Puis juste aussi mentionner que pour les tables, on va avoir une quinzaine d'observateurs de différents ministères et organismes qui vont pouvoir être présents. Ils ne vont pas participer parce qu'ils ont déjà passé à travers les consultations, donc normalement, leur point de vue et leurs perspectives ont déjà été reflétés dans le rapport, comme que je mentionnais, qui a été préparé. Mais ils vont quand même être là si jamais, pour une raison X, il y a des petites questions très précises par rapport à des ministères. Puis aussi, je trouve que c'est très enrichissant d'avoir des gens du gouvernement qui participent aux tables rondes. Dans le passé, c'est ce qu'on a fait, puis ça a été une excellente collaboration. Donc, maintenant, on passe à la conférence de cadrage. Qui essentiellement, ça va avoir une première partie aujourd'hui de 9h à 10h sur l'expérience néerlandaise puis la perspective sur l'opérationnalisation de l'économie circulaire parce que, comme on sait, il y a souvent des gens qui, de différents backgrounds, on va tous avoir une différente compréhension, définition même parfois de l'économie circulaire. Et donc, le but, c'est vraiment de prendre l'expérience néerlandaise où eux, depuis 2016, ont déjà une politique en place avec des cibles. En fait, ils veulent devenir circulaires à 100%, que leur économie soit une circularité de 100% d'ici 2050. Donc, j'ai pensé qu'il serait bien d'avoir des experts qui ont participé participer à élaborer en fait dans le gouvernement toute la démarche qui était nécessaire, puis le processus surtout de reddition de comptes, parce que souvent la question c'est de savoir qu'est-ce qu'on mesure quand on veut être circulaire. C'est pas toujours évident. Et après ça, de 10h à 11h, on a une pause. À ce moment-là, vous pouvez évidemment, en fait, vous sortez du logiciel, ça va être terminé. Puis pour la deuxième partie, qui va faire un peu l'état des lieux de l'économie circulaire au Québec, avec des acteurs québécois de 11h à 12h30, mais là, vous allez avoir un autre lien auquel participer. Je vous mentionne que en fait, les conférences sont enregistrées, donc on va pouvoir les visionner plus tard, mais ça ne sera pas demain parce qu'il va y avoir un peu de préparation à faire de notre côté avec notre équipe technique. Mais toutes les conférences seront disponibles sur YouTube et c'est pour ça justement qu'il fallait qu'on les sépare puis qu'on ait deux liens différents. Donc maintenant, je vous présente la première partie, donc sur l'expérience néerlandaise. Donc notre première conférencière, c'est Josepha Pottings. Je vais passer à l'anglais. Sorry, I will speak English because both of our conference guest speakers are Anglophone. Well, they're actually Dutch, but they will present in English today. So our first presenter is Josepha Potting. She is the CEO of Enviro Spotting, and she has a background PhD in environmental sciences. She has done a lot of extensive work with the Ministry of Environment for the Netherlands government to set up basically all of the framework in order to do the monitoring to follow the progress towards the government's target of 100% circularity by 2030. So she wrote a report, which I recommend to everyone, which is called Circular Economy, What We Want to Know and What We Can Measure. This is what I think is a great expertise that she can bring so we can understand what we need to have in terms of data and understand what we're measuring when we want to transitions towards a circular economy. Our second guest will be Yoke Dufourmont, who is the lead for the circular job economy at Circle Economy. And she's actually been, has a background, in aménagement du territoire, urbanism, I think, and she's worked actually quite extensively on supporting municipality that wanted to transition to circular economy, as well as working with different projects such as buildings and so on. So all of the detailed biography of our conference guest speakers are available, so I invite you to go and read them. And now I will give Josepha, our first speaker, the control to give the presentation. So Josepha, if you want, you can. It's you have the control.
Thank you, Joanna, for introducing me and for inviting me as a speaker to this interesting conference. I'd first like to give a short introduction into the Dutch circular economy policy and circularity activities in the Netherlands. Then I will continue with the philosophy behind the Dutch monitoring system, for which I was coordinator when I still worked at PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. I also will show you some first monitoring results, and if time allows, I will also say a few words about the overlap between circular economy and the energy transition. As you might have noticed from my title slide, it said circular economy is more than recycling only. And it is important to know that in Europe, and particularly in the northwestern European countries, we also have a very competitive and very efficient recycling industry. That is not to say there is no room for improvement. There is room for improvement. For instance, the quantity and the quality of plastics recycling is still very low. But having said so, recycling will remain important within the circular economy, but recycling alone is not enough to reduce the use of natural resources, particularly abiotic resources, to a level that will warrant a secure supply of natural resources to the Dutch economy, will reduce the environmental pressures from resource extraction and processing enough, while circular economy also goes along with creating socio-economic values. It's important to stress that the focus in the Dutch circular economy policy is on reducing natural abiotic resource use. And when I say resources, I really mean resources and no materials, because as long as we use secondary materials, that is less of a problem. But the focus is really on reducing the use of natural resources that we need to produce virgin materials. So the objective of the Dutch circular economy policy for 2050 is to use as little abiotic natural resources as possible, and as an interim objective, in 2030 the use of abiotic natural resources should be halved compared to 2014. And the policy plan basically distinguishes between 3 strategic pathways to arrive there. The first strategic path, the second strategic pathway, is to replace abiotic resources by sustainable, extracted, and generally available resources. And most notably, that will be bio-based resources. But then, of course, at some point, also the supply of biotic resources will become a problem, especially also when we use them for green energy. So the second and the third strategic pathway are to improve the efficiency of resource use, or so you want to reduce the use of those resources in existing product chains and in new product chains. And this resource efficiency can basically take place in several ways. We developed a circularity ladder with 10 strategies, where the upper 3 are very much focusing on not using products any longer or delivering their function in a more efficient way. The next 5 circularity strategies are about using products and their components longer, amongst others by reusing them. And then the last strategies are about material recycling. So this circularity ladder is very much about focusing on products. And as a matter of fact, it is focusing on product functions, because as the example here shows, you need a hole in a wall, but you don't necessarily need a drill to have a drill in possession for that. I skipped this slide, but what I want to show you here is that circular economy basically represents a shift from waste management to resource management. And that is illustrated here by showing that the first 3 circularity strategies are basically a specification of prevention in the waste hierarchy. And the next 5 circularity strategies are a specification of reuse in the waste management waste hierarchy. Circular economy builds in the Netherlands on waste policy and policy around bio-based resources. It links to a couple of other policy areas, among which environmental policies and food and agricultural production and others. But it is a distinct policy field in itself, focusing on resource management. Here has happened something strange, because there were slides which has disappeared. That is irritating. I go to... I'm very sorry about this. I don't know what happened here. Nah. Okay, I don't know what happened here. This slide shows you the circular activities taking place in the Netherlands. It is based on an inventory the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency made. And what it basically shows is some 85,000 circularity activities, which are concentrated in the most populated parts of the Netherlands, which is the western part close to the sea, where Amsterdam and Rotterdam, the 2 big cities, are located. This shows for the 5 priority areas in the Dutch circular economy policy, what the circular economy activities are. And well, the main message you can take from here is that for the biomass and food activities, those are located in the more remote parts of the Netherlands where the agricultural activities are, and the other activities have their dominance, as I already said, in the more populated parts of the Netherlands. So if you look to those 85,000 circularity activities, then only 2% of them are innovative circularity activities. So the large majority is existing activities. And that is actually logic if you think that repairing cars and washing machines, etc., are of course also part of the circular economy. And you can see that the bar for repair and refurbish in the existing activities on your left hand, that is where the most circular activities take place. If you look to the bar chart on the right hand, where it shows the innovative circularity initiatives, then you can see that it is actually dominated by recycling activities, while the higher circularity strategies are as to yet less represented. And since circular economy is more than about recycling only, that is basically a point of attention that those higher circularity strategies should also get more emphasis. Here are a few examples of innovative ideas. You can read them afterwards, because I now like to move to the philosophy behind the circular economy. If you want to make a transition from the linear to the circular economy, that basically means two things. The first thing is that you have to build up a circular system. That is the emerging system in a green curve. But at the same time, you also have to break down the existing linear system. And breaking down the linear system and building up the circular system is a complex and lengthy process that will take time. So it will also take time before you can measure the effects from the transition to a circular economy on the use of resources and the reduction of environmental pressures and resource supply security. But you already want to know now, or in the short term, whether you're moving in the right direction with your circular economy policy. So for that reason, in the Dutch monitoring system, we distinguish between monitoring the effects that you want to achieve with the circular economy transition and the transition process that you need to make the change from a linear to a circular economy. So that's a very important distinction that is made in the monitoring framework. And this slide shows the structure of the Dutch monitoring system. It is layered in several ways. I already mentioned that we distinguish between measuring the effect and measuring the transition process. So you also need effect indicators for that and transition indicators. All indicators will in principle cover the whole product chain, and they will be measured at the level of single product systems, but also to economic areas which are defined as priorities in the Netherlands. And you want to measure on the Netherlands as a whole what the progress in the circular economy policy is. In the mean, there also has made some other specifications. As I told before, the 2030 aim is to halve the resource use, the abiotic resource use, with the final aim to lower the environmental impact in the whole impact chain and to warrant a secure natural resource supply. But of course, for some resources that will work out differently. We have a tremendous amount of sand, which is an abiotic resource, but as I will show later, we have a couple of very rare metals, which are very important for economy. So this halving objective needs specification per material or per resource based on its criticality for the Dutch environment and based on the environmental impact that goes along with it and its economic value. It has to relate to the input, to the use and the output of those resources. And that's a typical Dutch thing. But for these priorities that I mentioned, transition agendas have been developed. So there also needs to be a specification of this halving objective. To show you some results, the framework as we developed and released it in 2018, it contained a zero measure, the baseline, for 2014. Beginning of this year, the monitoring has been repeated, and here it shows an overview of all the actions and initiatives which are to be found in policy documents. And the light blue, well, it basically shows that there is a shift from recycling, which dominated a couple of years ago and still is very dominant, but it is becoming slightly less and moving to higher circularity strategies, particularly repair and refurbish springs out here, but also reuse is increasing. Then just an example about the potential to avoid carbon dioxide emissions by circular procurement. So this is a potential which has not been realized yet. But as you can see, there is a considerable potential to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by refurbishing office furniture and by extending its lifetime. And similarly, if you look to road infrastructure. This is a fairly complex figure. What it basically shows is that most of the natural resources which are imported by the Netherlands are also exported again, because the Dutch economy is very much a trade-based economy. And it also shows, and Joke in the next presentation will elaborate a bit more on it, that as to now, about 25% of the natural resources used in the Dutch economy will flow back in the economy through recycling and reuse, etc. For the monitoring in the future, there are also identified few information lacks. It is difficult in the statistics to distinguish between economical sectors and the amount of secondary materials they use. The reuse of products and materials can be improved, and the same applies to the quantity and the quality of the material outflows, which flow out of the stocks. And the stocks are all products which are used in a year, which are used longer than 1 year, so which form a stock in the economy. This slide shows you the materials which are critical for the Dutch economy, and it shows you also which products use them. And to make a long story short, it is basically in electrical and electronic equipment that use rare metal resources which are precious, like the ones that you can see in the world map on the right. And you can see it here once again. So the previous slides were mainly about measuring the effects of the circular economy transition. This slide is about the suggested indicators for measuring the transition process. And there's too much information on this slide for you to read now. So I suggest you will read it in more details afterwards. But what it basically tells is if you want to move from a linear to a circular economy, you first of all need to have the capacity, the knowledge to make this transition. You need to have the permission from existing regulations to make that move. And you also need to have the motivation. That are the three main pillars which support the transition to a circular economy. And within those three pillars, we distinguished between the means that you need, like money to pay experiments or circular labor forces, that kind of things, the activities that you need to undertake, like creating awareness on the consumers or changing laws so that food waste can be reused as, for instance, feed for animals, which is now prohibited in the Netherlands. And you also want to measure what are the final achievements, not only in the sense of, for instance, publications or the number of laws that you changed, of the market volume of circular procurement, but also the extent to which you were able to achieve a circularity strategy. Now, this measuring of transition process indicators, that is, I would say, the main innovation of the Dutch monitoring system. It is not something which is regularly done. So those indicators are proposed. They are not existing yet, or they were not existing at the time that we proposed them. And they are now working on it to make it possible to really measure those indicators. But to give you an example,
just a reminder that you have a couple of minutes left.
Okay, I think I'm fairly close to finishing. Here it shows an example of patents for bio-based products, distinguished to different applications, and this is one of those transition process indicators that has to be measured. I will skip this slide. I also will skip to conclusions which fairly straightforward follow from my presentation. And I like to come to my recommendations for you in your discussions about circular economy policy in Quebec. These are my personal recommendations. I make them on my own title. But first of all, I would really focus your circular economy policy on resource management and not use it or make it equal to, I don't know, to bioeconomy policy or energy policy or climate policy. Obviously, circular economy policy is overlapping with those policy fields, but they are not one-to-one together. And yeah, I think it would be really a pity to water down circular economy policy by focusing it too much on already existing policy fields, while we really need policies for reducing natural resource use. Then, as mentioned, circular economy involves moving beyond recycling to higher circularity strategies. I hope I made that point clear. I just repeat it here. I think it is very important, and that is also very much the core of the Dutch circular economy policy, to use the creativity from stakeholders. And stakeholders can be everywhere: the environmental movement, big companies, small companies, the financial world, consultancies. There are many people and many societal partners which have good ideas how to come to a circular economy, or at least circular initiatives. I also think that you should keep aware for people with strategic behavior, which are just using the term circular economy to sell some old stuff. And a last thing, which I also think is very important, and I think the Dutch government really does a good job, is to keep the enthusiasm of stakeholders up. And what they do in the Netherlands is that they every year organize a national conference, and this national conference has as a main aim that all the stakeholders can meet each other, that they talk with each other, and that they celebrate the step forwards that have been made. And it is really, if you are there, there is really a vibrant environment, and a lot of people in other policy fields are quite jealous about the enthusiasm there is in the Netherlands for the circular economy. So this was my last recommendation. The sources that I used are mentioned, and you can access them later on. And then I just want to thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, I will later on answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, José. So I'm going to pass it on immediately to Joke. We have we're already a little bit over our time. Wanted to finish at 10, but we have 15 minutes, so it might go a little bit overboard, especially if we want to take questions. So Joke, the floor is yours if you're able to take control of the screen. Joke?
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we are. Yeah, so also from my side, this is Joke speaking. Thanks again, Joanne, for inviting us to present at this conference, this highly relevant conference, and a very exciting time for Quebec and giving shape to the Sustainable Development Strategy. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of Circle Economy. Circle Economy is a social enterprise. We're based in Amsterdam, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to the circular economy. Now, we're doing that in a lot of different ways. We're active in sectors such as the construction sector, the finance sector, the textile sector, but we also have programs running on cities and urban development. For example, we have one program that focuses on the circularity gap reports, about which I'll tell you a little bit more in a second, and one on jobs. The program on jobs is called the Circular Jobs Initiative, and that's exactly my position in the organization as I'm leading that program. Now, the first thing that I wanted to open with is that the world can be considered 8.6% circular. This is a number that we calculated for this year. So the state of 2019-2020 is that of all the resources that are used around the world, only 8.6% are fed back into the economy. And to make it a little bit more painful even, this is a lower number than last year. So for all of the efforts that we are doing, we are still not on the right track. Now, 8.6% for the entire world, it's a big number, it's a big fluffy thing, and that doesn't give us any information in terms of policy making. So we're going to need to break it down just a little bit more. And that's why we started looking into circularity gap for nations and for countries. And I'm very happy to announce here, for those of you who haven't heard it yet, that we'll also be performing a circularity, or that we'll be developing a circularity gap report for Quebec. The word is out since yesterday. Very excited that that collaboration and project is going ahead. Now, what we can see for circularity gap for countries is that roughly around the world, we can categorize all countries in either growing, a building, or a shifting state. And that means that indeed, when it comes to resource consumption and cycling materials, there are different patterns that are happening on the national level. Where certain countries have currently a very small economy, are still very much focused on building all of that up, we'll see that a very, very slow increase in terms of both resource consumption and production. Then there's growing countries who started very small, but they're very much booming, and there we see a massive increase in material footprints. And what we have to pay particular attention to is the shift countries. There where we have countries with very high levels of social welfare, and I think we can count both Canada and the Netherlands amongst two shift countries. We have to drastically reduce that material footprint, and so there's a very heavy responsibility that rests on countries like ours in order to reduce that footprint. Now, one of the insights that we have for the Netherlands, for example, because we already conducted a circularity gap analysis for the Netherlands, is that we can say that from all of the resources that are being used in the Netherlands, almost 25%, so almost a quarter, is being fed back into the circular economy. And that is a very, very high number. And that's also the indicators that Jose just presented. We have an in-between indicator of 20, or an in-between threshold. Let's say by 2030, we want to reduce resource consumption, or primary resource consumption, by 50%. So that means that this number, or the circularity gap, has to decrease a lot still. When it comes to 2050, though, we're not saying the Netherlands needs to be 100% circular. No, the Netherlands needs to be fully circular. And this is because the circular economy is about so much more than recycling, as Jose said. And it's actually a lot more intricate as a system than just accounting for resource flows. And that's why I wanted to take a little bit of a step back and see where we are when it comes to defining circular economy. At the bottom of this screen, you can see a straight line, which roughly represents what we conceive of as a circular economy. And then the outer circle is what we conceive of as the recycling economy. As you can see, that's really just one of the feedback loops that we want to make sure happen in the circular economy. What we really want to do is make sure that we preserve as much value as possible. And this can only happen by keeping the loops as small as possible, and therefore not going back as much in the value chain. Now, as you can imagine, this very, very quickly becomes a much more complex system, a much more intricate system than just cycling resource flows. And that's why it's quite helpful to think of the circular economy as a coherent entity of strategies that we can implement, that we can pursue in order to achieve circularity. These are the 7 key elements of the circular economy. And we conceived of them based on a literature review, because as most of you will know, there is no one coherent definition, one definition of circular economy that all stakeholders agreed on. So based on this literature, or based on a literature review, we really wanted to see where is the consensus? What does everybody agree on constitutes the circular economy? And that's how these 7 key elements came into being. And then you can see that indeed part of it is about closing loops, connecting waste as a resource, etc. So when it's about renewable energies, about lifetime extension and about recycling. But so much of it is also about activities that need to support that, activities that need to enable those material loops to be closed. And then that's when you see the 4 enabling strategies coming to the surface. One of them is about rethinking the business model, and that's really making the circular economy a viable business strategy. So you'll start looking at sharing, you'll start looking at leasing, really making a business model out of using secondary resources. Another one is designing for the future, where if we want to be using secondary resources on the large scale, we can't keep designing appliances or products in the same way as we have been now. No, we need to design them for disassembly in order to facilitate reuse and recycling. Another strategy is incorporating digital technology, which will help us with all kinds of things, connecting the supply with demand on digital platforms, for example, but also keeping track of resources as they flow through our economy. And another one is, of course, collaboration. As we're setting up the system, collaboration is key. I think it was also the last recommendation in Jose's presentation. Now, as we've gone through this little recap of what constitutes circular economy, I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about public policy supporting the circular economy. Jose gave a very comprehensive overview of public policy supporting the circular economy in the Netherlands on the national level. But what I wanted to reaffirm is that circularity is not something that needs to happen on the national level only. It's of crucial importance that we connect different levels of policy making. And so that we make sure that from a multi-level governance perspective, circularity makes sense. And so that's why I made this overview of potential policy instruments that can be used to support the circular transition, going from regulatory instruments over economic instruments to soft instruments. Now, as you can imagine, each level of governance or each level of policy making can be more or less relevant for any of these instruments. And let's see if there's time. Maybe I can go 30 seconds into the different examples that I have here. But for example, if we look at the Netherlands and then Amsterdam specifically, as this is the place where I currently live and work, there's different levels of policy that influence circular economy development in the city of Amsterdam. So first of all, and in the picture on the extreme left, you can see a moment of the sign when on the national level the resource agreement was signed, and this was one of the milestone agreements of the Netherlands going on that path and setting itself a strategic goal of being fully circular by 2050. In the middle picture, you can see a goal where certain partners of the AMA region, and the AMA is the Amsterdam metropolitan area, where they had signed an agreement for more circular procurement. And so there it was about all kinds of public bodies within the Amsterdam metropolitan area collectively using their purchasing power to support the development or to create a market for circular products and services. And then lastly, you'll see a picture, and I realize there's a lot of pictures of people in here, but it's difficult to capture policy in a picture. The last picture is one of a network that exchanges information on recycling and reuse of concrete and rubble. And so that one is again a regional network in the kind of the heavily urbanized region in the west of the Netherlands. And so as you can see, within one place, there's multiple instruments at play that are influencing the reality, the market, the knowledge levels as we speak. And so this is just a little bit as an illustration of the role that policy, that public policy can play. Now, on top of that, we actually did an analysis on cities and municipalities that support circular economy in Europe, and how this affects job creation. Because that's one thing, it is one thing to pursue circular economy for environmental and economic gains, but it's a whole other one to include it or to link it to a social agenda. And I also want to say that especially now, especially in a time for green recovery, the circular economy is such a crucial instrument to be looking at the securing and the creation, the securing of certain existing jobs and the creation of new jobs. Now, in this analysis, we have found that actually municipalities implementing regulatory and economic instruments to support the local circular economy also created the most jobs locally. And that's when we come to the impact side of circular economy. You see that job creation is one of them, amongst a whole set of other ambitions. And we can linger on this slide, but I think we can all agree that we're looking at the circular economy as an instrument, as a vehicle for a greener and a brighter future. Now, if we're looking and focusing or zooming further into the job creation element, we see that by now we actually have a lot of evidence of what the circular economy can do to the labor market. A recent study by the ILO, for example, estimated a potential creation of 18 million green jobs by 2030. That's in 10 years, so that's not too far into the future. But then green jobs is a little bit more narrow than the circular economy as well. And then there's other studies that have been done in the past couple of years or so, where we see indeed a net positive effect. And you can see some worldwide, European Union, the Netherlands, and even on the city level in London and Amsterdam, for example. Now, all of this paints a very bright picture, a very positive and optimistic picture. But actually, when we scrutinize those numbers a little bit, it's also not the brightest picture or as much of a bright picture as we would have hoped for. Because circular economy is very often in one breath mentioned with job creation, because as a general rule of thumb, we understand that circular economy processes are more labor intensive than their linear counterparts. That means we'll obviously have some job creation. What we have to understand is in the circular transition, there will be people who lose out. And so the net job creation actually sticks to a couple of percentages max. Within Europe, for example, one of the landmark studies that's been done, we see a net increase of 700,000 jobs. So we're staying under the 1% increase in the labor market. So then you really start looking at where is the biggest shift going to happen in relation to the labor market, because it will be shifting. It's just that the pure numbers, the raw numbers, aren't necessarily the most interesting picture. What's interesting is what's going to happen underneath that curve, because we're going to see massive shifts. We're going to see entire sectors disappearing, entire sectors in decline, new sectors emerging out of nowhere, new sectors emerging as we can already see in renewable energy, for example, and then yet other sectors entirely transforming. So when we're looking at labor market implications of the circular economy, it's interesting to zoom into those qualitative aspects of circularity. And there I want to highlight 3 topics about skills, inclusion, and decent work. Now, these are some of the recommendations, and I wanted to include them in this presentation because I think it's crucial to take them into account when it comes to circular economy policymaking and when it comes to the formulation of a sustainable development strategy. Now, the first one is in terms of skills. As we'll see new sectors emerging, other sectors disappearing, and other sectors transforming, you'll understand that we're going to require a workforce with an entirely different set of skills. So as a first step, what we need to understand is actually, when it comes to the circular economy transition, what types of skills are we going to need? Because once we have that understanding, we'll also make sure that we adapt curricula, trainings, lifelong learning pathways, etc., in such a way that it actually supports the circular economy and that we'll not have to deal with labor shortages in the coming years to come. Another one is to create a policy environment that promotes circular business and skills. And what I mean with that is making sure that employers are actually incentivized to invest in the skill development of their workforce. And those are long-term investments to make. And this is one of the crucial differences between a circular and a linear economy, is that you base your economy on long-term investments. making sure that we avoid labor shortages and skill shortages in the future. And then we need to open up opportunities for lifelong learning and continuous development as well. And this is crucial because we're not only talking about future workers, we're also talking about the current workforce. And so in order to ensure a just transition to circular economy, we need to make sure that those workers that may be losing out now can actually be redeployed in other industries and other sectors. This is very, very quickly an image of the construction value chain. And what we did is we mapped a couple of circular economy strategies on this value chain and also mapped which workers would be active in these strategies. And that way you can slowly start having an insight as to how the professional landscape is changing. Now, secondly, we need to make sure that the circular labor market is an inclusive one. That means that we need to monitor a just transition for workers across all local and global supply chains. Now, that's already not a matter, of course, when it comes to local supply chains, much less for global supply chains. So this is one to keep in the back of your mind. It's also about creating pathways to work for people who face barriers to the labor market, in a sense that circular economy jobs need to be accessible to those most vulnerable in society. So we're talking about newcomers, about people with a disability, people who are currently at risk of being phased out. And lastly, we need to make sure to structurally integrate the social and solidarity economy in the circular economy. We know that by nature, from a lot of the processes that they already incorporate, such as cleaning, hardware removal, etc., a lot of these activities are inherent to the circular economy. But quite often still the social and solidarity economy remains a more anecdotal thing. And so we really need to make sure that it is structurally integrated, but also across all of the circular economy, seeing how we can learn from social and solidarity economy enterprises to really create that culture of stewardship within the corporate world. This is very quickly illustrating for you that indeed it is about those smaller and bigger loops in the circular economy, but there's many, many different steps in between. And all of those steps have job creating potential. Now, lastly is about creating, about introducing the decent work framework. And there it's about making sure that every circular job is a decent job. Now, firstly, we need to have a framework for that. That means that we need to understand what high quality work is, for example, the decent work framework of the ILO, but we need to apply it for on the circular economy, because the reality of the matter is that as of now, a lot of circular economy jobs are dirty jobs, or they're not decent work. In circular economy sectors, we struggle to meet just the most basic health and safety requirements. We rely on a massive informal workforce for our global waste management system. A lot of jobs in repair and maintenance and in waste management as well don't carry a lot of social value. So those are things that we need to safeguard when safeguarding decent work in the circular transition. So secondly, we need to strengthen the legal basis, meaning investing in social dialogue, working with social partners when it comes to defining and guiding that transition to the circular economy, because we don't only need to involve business, we also need to involve workers in that transition. And lastly is promoting the social value of jobs in the circular economy, as I already explained. Now, what it comes down to when it comes to the circular transition of the labor market is really combining SDG 8 and SDG 11. We need to make sure that SDG 11 doesn't only support SDG 8 by creating new forms of employment, new markets, and new sources of income, but also make sure that there's no trade-offs, between SDG 8 and SDG 12. And in order to do that, and this is where I come to the conclusion of this presentation, is with the Circular Jobs Initiative of Circular Economy, we really focus on those three topics, on jobs and skills in the circular economy, in order to ensure that the transition to circularity happens in a way that is positive for both work and workers. And I wanted to end with this last slide. in the sense that we all have a lot to learn. And so I'm very happy that we were invited here from the Netherlands to show some examples. Maybe you get inspired by a couple of the slides that we showed. But what I also want to say is that we don't have absolute answers yet. And so when it comes to circular economy, we need to all show innovation, we need to show creativity to actually face the challenges that we're facing, or to address the challenges that we're facing. And in that sense, when it comes to circular economy, we're all developing countries. That was it for the presentation from my side. I'm happy to stay online for a little bit longer to answer questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Yoke. We've already went over 11 minutes of the 1 hour we had. There's actually only one question that came in. Maybe I'll just take it and then we'll end the session. If there's other questions, please send it to me via email, and I'll be able to redirect it to Yoke or Josefa. I'm really sorry about the time constraint. That's the joy, I guess, of learning, of doing conferences on the web. But the question that we have is, somebody asked, do the indicators of Netherlands, are they based on the ones from European Commission and Eurostat? I don't know if Josefa or Yoke, you feel you can answer this.
Yeah, I can answer that.
Okay.
No, to some extent. Actually, the framework that we used in the Netherlands is the same framework that we developed with a couple of other European environmental assessment agencies. That was also a project that I was coordinating. We together developed this framework as a response to the European Commission that at that time was developing their own circular economy framework. We also had a talk with the European Commission about their proposed framework and our input on that with our own framework. And an important information from that discussion is, as it goes within this kind of national corporations, that to some extent the European Commission needs to take into account the progress, the level of progress in all the member states. And as a matter of fact, then a couple of southern and eastern European countries, they are still grappling with implementing a waste management policy, and they are less ahead than the northwestern European countries. And that also reflects in the indicator framework of the European Commission. If you look closer into this framework, it consists of 10 main indicators, and they are really dominated by waste management and recycling. And they are not so much reflecting, not clear enough at least, that the circular economy is needs to go beyond recycling and move to those higher circularity strategies.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe what's helpful to add here is that when it comes to monitoring, we really need to try and find a balance between having a robust framework that is interregionally and internationally comparable, and to also facilitate benchmarking and target setting, etc. But at the same time, we really can't stress enough how much local embeddedness and local relevance is important when it comes to developing monitoring frameworks. There, it's really about targeting those issues that are important for the region itself, for Quebec itself, in order to prioritize the right circular economy strategies. And of course, on top of that, as Jose said, look at the entire waste hierarchy. Don't only look at the bottom of it. And I'd like to add to that, of course, especially from my perspective, to not only look at the material side of it, but also look at the social side of it. And that really sits at the impact side of a monitoring framework.
Okay, thank you both of you. It's 10:15. There's one last question. I feel bad not to take questions because it's so important to be able to interact. But maybe if you can provide a super quick answer to this, one of you. It says, the question is, can you give examples of specific policy measures that can be put in place to eliminate obsolescence and to stimulate the repair economy?
Maybe I can kick off with a few. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Design Directive from the European Commission. That's one interesting one to look at. A second one, which would be more national level, is fiscal policy. There were, for example, Sweden and I think a couple of other countries by now have actually introduced a tax break for repair and refurbishment activities. So you're no longer paying 21% VAT, but 6% VAT on those types of activities, and drastically reducing the labor cost of course, of a repair job. And then maybe more on a local level, because I'm not sure what level of policy making you're mostly interested in. On a local level, we're seeing thrift shops and vintage shops and refurbishment shops. What's interesting is to actually see how they can be elaborated on and how they can be expanded to also include actually local refurbishing and remanufacturing storefronts. Again, embedding it, for example, with the social and solidarity economy.
And Yoke, I think I recently read that there's a Scandinavian country, I can't say which one, unfortunately, but that gives tax credits for people who repair some of their products. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yeah, so that's Sweden indeed. So that's the example that I mentioned, where it goes from 21 to 6% VAT. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So, okay, I feel terrible, but I have to unfortunately end it here. For everybody else, pour toutes les autres, on se revoit à 11h pour la partie 2. Je suis vraiment désolée que ça a été, on a débordé tout ça, mais je pense que les présentations ont été excellentes. So with that, thank you so much, Yoke. Thank you so much, Josefa, for your wonderful presentation. They're going to be made available to the participants soon, as well as this event that will be recorded and hopefully in the next few days be up on YouTube. So see everyone very soon in 45 minutes. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.